All right, we are now live, and I'm here with Brent Johnson, and the great pleasure, the great honor of having him on our podcast or vlog, however you prefer to say it. So, Brent, thanks for jumping on and chatting with us.
Hey, Andrew, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, all right. So, if you're first time here to Swift Immersive, we have speakers like Mr. Brent Johnson coming on board and speaking on this podcast. We've done this for quite a few years. You can check it out on our YouTube channel or other channels that we have. And I met Brent probably 15, 20 years ago, and he had a real big influence on my life back then. And just loved what he was doing at the time, connected with him then. And so been fortunate to reconnect with him and have our journeys cross. So, Brent, would you like to just share a little bit about back then to now, and then just a little bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, back then, Andrew, we probably met through Holly Pabecki, who was like famous for connecting everybody with everybody when she lived in the Seattle area, And so we were working on the repurposing business was part of what we were doing, and I was also doing a series on kingdom economics back then. And so we'd been repurposing companies, helping them to get their business into God's business. That had been going on for some time, and we would take teams of people from the US, take them out to South Africa, India, Indonesia, work with 10 companies at a time, and really go through the business top to bottom to say, how well does this business align with biblical principles? And mostly, how can it get a fresh purpose that's bigger than the bottom line? So we were doing that. Along the way, we figured, well, we really need to deal with the economic side of things as well. And that's probably we met, I think, either at a kingdom economics or a repurposing business session.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And how did you jump into this? How did you get involved with Kingdom Innovation, and
Yeah.
just what's kind of your story to your
Yeah.
rise?
Just in terms of personal background, I grew up in South Africa. My parents were interesting because they didn't have the language for it, but they were somewhat bivocational. So they ran their own businesses, but they also planted churches or started churches back then. South Africa was growing, and when a new area opened up, it needed a church, and so they would do those things in a dual way. And so that mixture was there. And so I joined Price Waterhouse straight out of college and straight out of university and became a chartered accountant, like a CPA in the US, and did that. And then I ended up leading a local church. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. God's going to tell me I can quit my job at Price Waterhouse and just do the church. But he didn't. So now I had two jobs, which was a lot of work and a young family. And then I started consulting to mission organizations. And what I saw, Andrew, was that there were things that each had to offer the other, but they spoke a completely different language. So I thought, man, we have to figure out how to bridge these worlds of business, mission, and local church so that the benefits can flow between the three of them. And so that began my journey back in the early 1980s. And frankly, it was also a matter of survival. I had to figure out how to integrate these things because you can't balance three full-time jobs. You have to figure out how to integrate them. So that was the challenge. Yeah.
I'm sure it was. And so how did you do that? That seems to be the great challenge of most people, is balancing everything that's in our lives.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think it was hard work. Looking back now, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, well, we figured out this, figured out that. But actually, it was a lot of wrestling through the concepts and just really becoming convinced that work is worship, that business is ministry. I'm not doing business to fund my ministry, that everything is God's. It's not like some things are God's. I frankly don't think the devil cares what you do on a Sunday if he can have Monday through Saturday. So, but when we see that everything is God's, and so it was a lot of just working through those things, which involves identity questions. What's your calling? How do you integrate your career with your calling? How do those become the same? And then what about your community and your church community and your faith community? If you have one, how do those integrate? And then this whole concept of how do we learn to co-create with God? Because a lot of people, if you take those 4 different areas, like your career sucks up a bunch of your time, and then you've got a family and they want time. So you're like, my job, my family. And then you've got this idea, yeah, but I want to change the world. I want to do something for God. And that gets a little bit of time. And then you think, oh, yeah, I don't really want to be an accountant. I want to be a lion tamer. But you don't have time to do it. And so the balance idea doesn't work. And I was taught the balanced Christian life. Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, in favor with God, in favor with man, Luke 2:52. But balance doesn't really work. You have to figure out that everything is God's. So therefore we have to integrate everything. And it took a while of working on that. And eventually in 1992, when we were by this stage in California, we moved there in 1986 with Price Waterhouse. We started something to work with entrepreneurs and business people to help them figure out the work-faith integration. And that was back in, over 30 years ago in 92. But it just took some hard work,
Eric Lundy has a great sermon on this and talking about 6 pillars in our lives.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to be able to maximize all 6. We need God's grace to be able to, help with those 6 areas in our life. So it's amazing that you were able to do that.
Yeah.
Was it easy to begin with, or was it a long grind? How did the process go for you?
A long ride. I think it was really just, it wasn't some big philosophical thing. In some ways, it was baby steps of obedience. So what does God want me to do next? And I made career decisions based on who I felt God was telling me I was at that point in time. And I made what some would call career limiting moves, quitting as a partner at KPMG, for example, or at Computer Sciences Corporation. I was also a partner there, to do something because, I felt God say to me, start an institute. I'm like, yeah, what's an institute? And so prayed about that and then felt, I originally thought I'll do it at Computer Sciences Corporation at CSC, but then through various people, including my wife, God spoke and said, look, you need to do this on your own. And so stepping away from a salary, from stock options and all of those things to just go and start out with something that was a step of faith. But there'd been enough instances where God had told me stuff before and he delivered. So this was building on what God had said. Now, has it been easy? No. Has it been successful from a worldly perspective? I don't think that if you charted everything out that it really makes sense. But if you look at our life, we've been to many, many countries, spoken to tons of people. I've just finished my 24th book or something like that I've written. I don't think I would have had time to do any of that if I was sitting in a corporate, just giving God the spare change, not from a heart perspective, but from a practical time perspective.
That's fantastic. And I think that really opens up the question between prosperity and wealth. What's the difference, in your opinion, between the two? Where, I was going to label this meeting or this event as disrupting scarcity and moving into abundance.
Yeah.
And, you had some concerns about that. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And then also just maybe speak into some of the small wins that started to help you start turning into bigger wins.
Yeah, I would say on the topic of prosperity, I think there's 2 equal and opposite errors. One is to say, well, poverty is great. It's a real virtue to be poor. And in some countries we've worked in, it used to be like that. If you were a business person who was doing well, people assumed that you were a crook or that you didn't love Jesus because you've got money in the bank. And the key thing was to be poor. That was the virtuous thing. In other countries, it's like, well, if you're doing well, then God is obviously blessing you. And both of those are opposite things. So understanding wealth versus riches, you might use those labels if you like. So, and and understanding how God measures success. I think that if wealth is a pursuit, then it's an idol. If it's a fruit, if it's an outcome of obedience, that's different. So Psalm 1 says, blessed is the person who's following God and so forth. He's like a tree planted by streams of water and so on, and then evergreen leaves and fruitfulness and all this stuff. It's great if success is a fruit, but if it's a pursuit, it's an idol. Doesn't matter how much money you've got. So figuring out a fresh scorecard for how we do life is pretty important. And then being comfortable. I remember once sitting on my deck in California. We had a house that we were renting, and my next door neighbor was like the chief legal officer at a big high-tech firm. And I looked across at his place and I thought, I remember when I used to have a proper job with a real salary. And I happened to be reading the Psalms, and in the Psalms it says, know that the Lord sets apart the godly for himself. So it's almost as if God's got 100 sheep and he says, well, I want to play with sheep number 65 or whatever. And it's like God sets. So if you're going along and you've got your idea of where you're heading, and then God says, no, I want to just take Andrew aside for a while because I want to hang out with him. I want to spend time with him. Well, it's not going to look like the chief legal officer of XYZ company next door. It's going to look different when God takes you aside. And that's his prerogative. We say, oh, yeah, the Lord's my shepherd. Yeah, that's great. But it's not just, fine cutlery and wine in the valley of the shadow of death. It's like sometimes I just want you on your own to prepare you, or just because that's what God wants. And so, yeah, we have to change our metrics on success. And it's hard to keep an eternal scorecard in mind because the world's scorecards are pressing in on us all of the time. I got a bit of an echo. Are you okay?
No, it sounds great on our end.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Right.
You can hear me? It's fine?
Yep, all good. Yeah.
Okay. What would be a great metric scorecard? What would be something that determines, like one of the struggles I've had is going into, let's say, secular organizations, creating success for those organizations, but then also aligning ourselves so that we are aligned with God's will, so that we're not partnering with kind of the spirit of mammon, but with the spirit of life per se.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, you want to think about, Andrew, about what is God's business, because we often say, oh, yeah, business is ministry and work is worship. That's cool. And God likes business. I've certainly made those statements. And one day I felt God challenge me. This was back in about 2002, to challenge me to profile his business, because I'd profiled hundreds of companies. I go in and I've got a formula, and different people have different ways of doing it. And for me, I've identified these 10 drivers of business impact, from the purpose through to the profit. And I've gone through and said, okay, for Cisco, for Apple, for this company, for that company, here's what their profile is, their business profile is. And you can get it off the internet. You can do a bit of search. Nowadays, you could ask AI to help you do it. So I felt God challenge me and say, hey, Brett, profile my business. And then I thought, man, if I could go to heaven for half an hour, interview God, and come back and say, hey, Andrew, I spoke to God. This is what his business looks like. That's pretty cool, because then when I look at any other business, I can say, well, how well does it align with God's business? This is the question. So in John 15:15, Jesus says, I'll give you the revised business version first, and then I'll tell you what he really said. So Jesus says, hey, if you don't understand my dad's business, you're not my friend. So now he's been with the disciples for 3 years. He's been revealing the Father's business to them. And he says, I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't understand the master's business. But everything that the Father showed me, I showed you. So now I'm calling you friends, because you understand my Father's business. Now you can ask whatever you want, and I'll do it for you. So if you just look at that the other way around, it's like, if you don't understand my dad's business, you're not my friend. And so then what does God's business look like? What's the purpose of his business? And then what is he doing? So we know one of the commissions that we have, or the mandates that we have, is to go into all the world and make disciples of nations. And we kind of slim that down and say, oh yeah, well, we should disciple individuals. And what does that mean? Oh, we should teach them how many books in the Bible and how to pray and how to manage their money or steward their money and so forth. But it's much bigger than that in Scripture, right? And so if God wants us to do that, if that's his thing, then we have to look at our business and say, is my business making disciples, for example? So then a metric for the business is, am I taking people on a journey from maybe not knowing how to work with God to how to work with God? A friend of mine has said that discipleship is teaching people to work the way that God designed them to work. Okay, so just hold that thought for a moment. So years ago, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm meeting with a guy from Bank of America, and he's in their private wealth division. And he says, oh, Brett, it's cool. I've been reading all of these books about God and business, but I don't get the connection to my job. So I said, what do you do? He said, oh, I'm a wealth manager. I said, what does a wealth manager do? So I'm playing dumb and I'm asking him questions. He's like, oh, well, a client comes to me with $5 million and I have to turn it into $7 million. I'm an asset manager. So I said to him, well, find your job in the Bible. And just the screensaver went on. You know, he couldn't think of his job in the Bible. So then I began to unpack for him how God is an asset manager. You know, it's like the parable of the talents. Here's the situation. I'm going away. I'm going to give you 5 million. When I come back, I expect you to have more than 5 million. And so then I began to unpack with him how God is an asset manager as well. And now if he can take his wealthy San Francisco client and teach them to invest the 5 million, not just to get 7 million, but to also get a return for eternity, then you and God are in the same business if you're doing that. Then every day you go to work, you got to talk to your clients, you got to understand their purpose, you got to understand how they're wired, you got to understand their hopes and dreams. How do they feel about money? How do they feel about resources? And how do they deploy capital that produces a return for eternity? That's not just going to give you a growth of that beats the index or 20% now or whatever, 5 million to 7 million, 5 million to 10 million. But it's going to be, when you're gone, you've actually produced something with the money that stored up a treasure in heaven, that impacted people, that changed the world, that made it better, that solved a problem that God cares about. If you do that, then you and God are in the same business. And every day you go to work and you are shaping the thinking, the habits, the lives, the motivations of your clients, you and God are doing the same thing. Now, there's a couple of obstacles to that, Andrew. One is we think, and I used to think this, when I was pastoring a church, I used to think, number one thing, first I got to get people saved. If they've got to get in a relationship with Jesus, then I can disciple them. I mean, it's just not true. Jesus called these guys the disciples, the followers, before they were quote unquote saved, you know. And so we can disciple pre-believers. If we believe that, then every business can make disciples from the first, not even the first day you hire somebody, from when you interview somebody until they leave your company. You can teach them to work like God, to think like God, to have habits like God. You're making disciples. You're not trying to make converts, though. That can happen, but you can definitely make disciples. And a business guy, as a business person, I can do it better than when I was a pastor. Why? Because I'm paying the people salaries. I tell them when to show up at work, how to work, what's acceptable behavior, what isn't acceptable behavior. I can identify their baggage, the junk in the trunk that's stopping them working the way that God designed them to work. When I'm a pastor, they come and listen to me for 45 minutes on a Sunday, I used to preach for a long time. Meantime, they're thinking about their unread emails, their social media. Do they want to go mountain biking or windsurfing or whatever they're thinking about? It's like the bumper sticker. Somebody said, I'd rather be on my mountain bike thinking about God than in the pew thinking about mountain biking. Now, I don't really agree with that, but I'm sure there were a bunch of people listening to me preach for 45 minutes on a Sunday versus people who work with me 50 hours a week. It's just no contest as to who can better make disciples.
No doubt. Wow, you hit a lot of interesting points there, a lot of good conversation, and I think what you're really tying into is multiplication. What you're really dovetailing with is when we disciple others and leaders and other people within an organization, we're really tapping into the power of multiplication.
Well, I think it's I think that there's people. I met a guy. I have a good friend actually in Indonesia who used to be a pastor of a church. Then he got into doing leadership stuff, got a PhD in leadership. And one day, and this is in the most populous Muslim country in the world, right? And one day his pastor says to him, so what are you doing for the kingdom of God, through your business? And my friend said, well, I lead 200 people to Christ every year. And the pastor is like, how do you do that? He was quite shocked. He said, well, I teach on leadership and I teach on how to live an impactful life, how to live a successful life, how to have a fulfilled life. And then people come to me afterwards and they say, I want to be like you. And he said, well, you can be like me. The difference between you and me is Jesus. And so he leads 200 mainly Muslims to Christ a year. I mean, that's like one a day. I mean, I haven't led 200 people to Christ in my life. And this is what he does. And it's just built into his business. He's teaching people leadership, how to have a powerful leadership life,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, leadership is definitely a powerful principle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to you kind of alluded to on the wealth kind of thing is that back in about 2006 or 7, we began to notice that God was giving people business ideas or concepts or product ideas that could make a difference. And so the principle there is that God's resources are unlimited. So economics, we probably both had to study economics once upon a time. And the fundamental premise of economics is that resources are scarce. It's the allocation of scarce resources. Well, is that a biblical principle? Is God short of resources? Well, you might say, being from Canada, the ice pack is melting and so on. And yeah, sure, we have it. Probably is not melting.
Our igloos are melting. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Pick on our igloos.
Yeah. So the point is that creation care, great, that's fine. That's one of our responsibilities. But the concept of scarce resources is questionable because God is still creating. And so when I look at things, I ask business people, how many products do you think are still in God's mind that we haven't seen yet? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting what some people will come back and say, oh, like 5% more. Others will be like, no, 99% more. So it's all over the map. So it's like, okay, here's a simple thing, here's a knife. Well, does God have any better ideas for a knife? Or for apps, or for food, or for how to do whatever? Does God have a better way to do something that he would love to share with humankind? He'd love to say, man, those people in Canada, they get really cold in the winter. I've got an idea I'd like to share with them, And so our job is like, okay, God, so what would be the idea for a battery-powered puffy jacket or something? We've already got one of those, USB-powered and so on. Or for whatever it might be, So God wants us to look for problems that are on his mind that we can then co-create solutions to. And so that's the normal part of co-creating with God. We're made in his image. God creates. And I think with the whole AI era, that we're closer than we've ever been to God spoke and it came into being. I mean, probably today, both you and I have chatted to our favorite AI tool and said, hey, I'm thinking about this, or create this with me, or help me do that. It's like something basically comes out of our mouth, and using a dictation type of tool that comes out of your mouth, it goes into your AI tool and it spits out something. It might be junk or it might be decent. I mean, we still have to have discernment. But the point is, possibilities for co-creation are kind of interesting at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love it. That's why we invented Blake.ai, was that, you could put your ideas into Blake and keep those protected versus, sometimes that data gets leaked over or you don't know who's taking that information. So that's exactly it. How do we keep that information in alignment with our resources and where we're moving? Love what you had to say about scarcity. Is that something you've seen in your own life or your own business, where you've been able to go into a business and see a shift from a scarcity kind of thinking model to something that creates ideas and generates ideas?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is just a very simple thing. We were working with a company in Bandung in Indonesia, and it came out in the conversation. Now, the founders of the company also planted a local church. There were elders in the church. They weren't like wishy-washy, twice-a-month Christians. They were gung-ho, right? But they had a well on their property where their factory was. And they told my wife, Lynn, yeah, the villagers come and they draw water from this well, but we only let them do it 6 months of the year. And Lynn said, well, what do they do when you stop their access? No, well, they have to go to another village to get the water. And Lynn's like, well, why do you stop them having access? Well, somebody told us the well might run dry. And Lynn's like, has it ever run dry? I mean, they're pretty much on the equator, it like rains over the equator. Like, no, it's never run dry. Well, why don't you trust God to just give them access the whole time? So there's a very practical kind of thing. It's like running out versus running over. There's a different sort of mindset. So in the kingdom of God, the measurement is not what you keep, it's what you flow through.
Right.
Those guys weren't going to get to heaven and Jesus was going to say, well done, you saved so many liters of water over the period of It's like, it'll be, hey, you gave so many people so many million liters of water over their lifetime, saving them this kind of, and you trusted me that you would never run dry. So there's a practical small example. Another situation, I was working with a company in South Africa, and we had a group of people going through our training. This was in 2017. And we were talking about products and co-creating products and this concept that God isn't done creating. So I asked this one guy, Brant Kutsia, asked him, what do you do? He said, I make nutraceutical products, is what he does. FDA approved, all of that stuff. And I said, well, God isn't done creating products. Why don't you ask God for a new product? And by the way, I've recorded his story and a bunch of others in this Inspired Innovation book, because we got so many of these inspired innovations, and I began to see some of the patterns and the principles. So Brunt's story is in here. And so I said to him, why don't you ask God for a new product? And years ago, he was worried about alien vegetation in South Africa. It's a mesquite tree. Originally, they come out of Texas, and the roots go down super deep into the earth, and they suck up a lot of the water. They use up resources, and then they have these flowers and then pods on them, like these big hanging pods, and then they just replicate. And the government will pay you to cut them down, burn them, get rid of them. So his first thing he did was he started a furniture factory. He thought, okay, I'll take the problem and I'll make furniture, you know. And then God told him to do something else. And so, long story short, by the time I met him, he was making nutraceutical products that deal with blood pressure and so on out of the pods. He had them analyzed at universities. So then, I said, why don't you ask God for a new product? And he came back to me a while later and he said, I've got a new product. It's called Mana Brew. And Mana Brew is an espresso replacement. So for people who can't handle caffeine, it's a caffeine-free espresso that's made out of these mesquite pods. They roast them and grind them. And it's a superfood. Is what yeah. And he's had amazing favor on the business. You know, God's just like, for example, Al Jazeera did an article, like a video and an article on him. And others have done this. And he's dealing with the environmental issue, job creation for the people in a very poor area where there's indigenous people living there and they don't have year-round work. It's a health drink that solves problems for other people. So it has multiple benefits. And it comes out of him just saying, okay, God, show me another product.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many different directions this conversation should go or could go. I guess I see that as an interesting issue within the economic system where, you know, the healthcare system, they use the IP of different inventions and they make them synthetic so then they can then kind of keep that under their own umbrella rather than allowing the marketplace to take that invention and innovate within the marketplace.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought through that at all? Or
Yeah, exactly. So one of those situations actually happened in Southern Africa, Botswana and South Africa. So the local bushmen, you might remember the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, way back, you know, and that whole thing. Well, the bushmen...
You're aging us here a bit.
That's right. The bushmen have an appetite suppressant that they get out of a particular kind of cactus. It's called hoodia. And basically they would chew on the stuff and it would, so they could go days without eating, you know, as what they were hunting and so forth. Well, one of the big pharmaceutical companies tried to patent that and create a synthetic version. And assisted by some people I know, the indigenous peoples took them on in court. And the indigenous people and said, this is our IP. And they won the court case. The indigenous people won the court case. And actually, I've seen quite a wave of pharmaceutical type products coming out of natural products. And yeah, then the thing is, the big pharma would like to either squash them or turn it into a synthetic. But there is a growing movement of people who are trying to do something different and capture those things where God has given knowledge, or there is inherent answers for cancer, for diabetes, for other things within natural products. And then, you know, big pharma wants to go where it's profitable, and sometimes it costs them, you know, tens of millions to develop something, hundreds of millions, and that's okay. And at other times, the answer is there in nature, and so we do have friends that we work with who are trying to work with the least of these, as it were, saying, okay, we'll create products for people who can't afford the Western prices, as it were, versus the other way around.
Interesting. Yeah. What do you see as a way that can protect the natural environments, the natural stewardship of the land, the product, the IP, so to speak, and allow us to stay in a place where that's always available to us versus going the synthetic way, the AI way, so to speak.
Yeah, I would say there's several things I've seen. One is I've seen people, and I'm working with people now, who actually put stuff into trade secrets versus patents. So they just say, look, because once you file a patent, stuff becomes common knowledge and people find workarounds, the patents and so on. So people keep stuff as trade secrets rather than patents. So that's been something. And then the other way is, there are having ways to make sure that the inventors and the investors get a fair return, and neither of them gets overly greedy. Because if you invent a new gizmo, and particularly if you're a faith-based person and you think God gave me the idea, then you become super protective of it because it's God's idea. Versus saying, God's given me this and I want it to benefit millions and millions and millions of people. So you almost need a mechanism that balances the interests of the inventors and the investors with pre-agreed contracts. So one of the things that this boils down to, in my view, and we've set up an organization that will sit between inventors and investors to give them both a fair return, but agree that if there's an excess beyond your fair return, it goes into an evergreen fund to fund kingdom projects. So, and that's a mechanism I've worked on for about 20 years. And that means when you get down to your typical term sheets or deal sheets, often what's more important than taking equity, for example, is a share of revenue. So that the inventor keeps their equity. The cash infusion is not going to separate them from their calling, but the investor gets a fair return and an ongoing return. It's not just 5 years and you're out, and then that business goes for 50 years. So I think that there are different ways to structure financing to honor both parties. Sometimes an exit is fine. Sometimes, look, you put your money in 3 years. As an investor, you get them up and going and you move on to the next thing. If that's what you like doing, getting companies up and going, structured, up and going, that's fine. There are other times where you stay with something for a long time.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic that you've thought about that for 20 years. That's amazing. All right. What are some of the best examples of companies that have rewarded their employees for coming up with ideas, innovation within their businesses to help them move their ideas, innovation forward, where both parties partner together in the rewards of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, if you look at big companies, people probably know this, but you take a big company like Boeing. A friend of mine, probably a mutual friend of ours, works at Boeing. He's an engineer. Man, he's a corporate guy. He's been there for decades. But while he's been there, he's filed patents. Now, Boeing owns the patents. But when a patent is successful and is producing income for the company, then he gets bonuses. He gets paid because of that. So he's encouraged within the corporate environment to be creative, to come up with stuff, to come up with solutions. And Boeing clearly owns the patent, but he gets a reward. So that's within the big corporate environment that you see some of those type of things, and which is great. I think it's a good idea, and it encourages people to come up with solutions. Google has been famous for giving people X% of their time. They said 20% of their time to work on whatever they feel like. Well, I'm sure that's probably 20% of a 70-hour work week, but but the point is that there are companies that have tried to say, okay, if our employees come up with something, but unfortunately there's also corporate politics where the company, and you've probably had it, I've had it happen, where you come up with something and then a corporate takes your idea and sort of bastardizes it and makes it their own.
Mhm.
I would say in the smaller companies, the encouraging people to actually teaching people how to hear God during the product development process. If you have a faith-based business, so if somebody says to me, "Oh, I'm a kingdom company," quote unquote, I have a faith-based business, then I want to ask, for example, okay, how many of your products came through divine inspiration? How many inspired innovations are in your product base? I mean, it's a fair question. I'm not saying it's not a kingdom business, quote unquote, if there's nothing, but it is a bit unusual if God is your senior partner, you're the junior partner, and you've got 20 products or 100 products, and none of them came from God. It's like, that's a bit odd, you know? So we need to develop the habits of involving God in our product development cycle. I remember hearing a guy, Don Cypher, speak in the Bay Area. I think he had about 100 and something patents to his name, like 120, 130. And he had been at Xerox PARC back in the day, then other tech companies. And he said, I think 35 of them just came to him in dreams. Like he gets a dream at night, wakes up, writes it down, goes back to sleep. And I have a good friend of mine in South Africa, and he works at a munitions company. Well, he's a rocket scientist. He works on rocket launches and putting satellites in space and all sorts of things. And he's had numerous dreams where God has given him solutions to engineering problems. And some of them have saved the company. You know, when the company's going downhill and he gets a brand new product idea and they're able to patent it and go forward. So whether you're in a corporate or whether you're in a smaller company, creating a culture where people co-create with God, involve God in the product development process, ask him for ideas. And then they've got to have the disciplines or the structure, the railroads to kind of run those ideas out. I remember once praying and saying, God, I need a new product idea. And he's like, I already gave you one. I'm like, oh, shoot. I have to go back on my journal and pull it out. So I got the idea. I'd sketched it out and everything, but I didn't put a deck together. I didn't put a workflow together. How are you going to do it? You know, so it's no good me getting the idea and then doing nothing with it, right? And so learning how to steward the stuff that God gives you. I recently had a situation, and I thought about this is like me and God. You know, I'm walking through the house and Lynn asks me a question. I start answering the question and she's like, I can't hear you. I was just asking. I'm like, that's like me and God, you know. I ask God a question and then I walk away and he's trying to give me the answer. And so learning how to co-create with God, how to listen, how to test things. And in the Inspired Innovation book, I asked a bunch of people who created products, so how did you get it? Some guys are like, oh, 3 a.m. in the morning, I wake up. Other guys, yeah, I'm mountain biking, then this happens. Another guy, I'm walking on the beach. Another guy, you know, I'm sitting in the john, I'm sitting in the toilet, you know, so I don't take my cell phone there because I want to have time to think. And other people are like, oh, brainstorming. It's very different for different people. I mean, people, visions, dreams, a handful with an audible voice. God told them, you know, do this in an audible voice. One lady in South Africa, she was selling real estate. And God told her in an audible voice to write a book for pre-sexually active kids, like early teens, to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. I mean, she's never written a book in her life, but she does it. And it ends up in the official curriculum of many provinces in South Africa and in Namibia. I mean, I mean, just an audible voice. God tells her to do something completely out of whack with her normal day job.
Hmm.
And so some people, it's that. I mean, literally, I've sat with people who've seen like a Disney movie of a new product or a new process. One guy I met many years ago, God showed him how to get oil out of the ground. What's now become fracking, God showed him decades ago in a dream, like in a vision, open vision at 2:40 in the morning or whatever, several nights in a row, and then again 6 months later after he tested it in the lab and he adjusted the process. Well, different things to different people. But the point is, we learn to co-create with God and be involved in coming up with stuff that solves real problems. And one of the reasons I love working in Africa is because people are trying to solve real problems. In America, it's like, how do I get my laundry quicker, or how to get the best table at the restaurant?
First world problems.
These are first world problems, And but what I love seeing with people, we've done something in Nigeria for quite a while called the Kingdom Summit, and then we started something called the Goshen Impact Fund, and we had people submit business plans, and people came in and they're like, "Oh yeah, my aunt had her foot amputated, so now I've created a way to 3D print prosthetics, or something like that. Or I'm working in agriculture and people's produce is going bad, so I've created a mobile refrigerator that can sit in the fields," whatever the problems are, And some are low tech, some are high tech, but they're solving real world problems that God cares about.
Wow, that's amazing. Have you had a chance to watch The Corporation, the movie The Corporation?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay. It just talks, that the corporation is the reason why most evils exist in the world. It's really an interesting movie and movement. There's quite a lot of people that believe in that, the deeper you go in that. What, in your opinion, would be some of the best business models that invoke innovation within the marketplace? Like, for example, there's employee owned type of business models. Um, there's other types that will really foster that innovation within their own companies rather than seeing that innovation leave their company and start afresh or start anew.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I think that there are good examples, and it does get down to what's your philosophy of business. There's a lot of young people, Andrew, who are concerned. They are anti-corporations because they see capitalism, what they perceive as capitalism, which is really greed. It's not proper capitalism. It's just corporate greed. There's a difference between capitalism in its purest sense and corporate greed, right? So in scripture, mammon is greed deified, that's what it means, making a god out of greed. And many companies do that. They will do anything to improve products, whether it's starting a war, or whether it's causing political upheaval, or whatever it might be. I just watched a documentary recently based a lot around a book by a guy called Thomas Pakenham called The Boer War. So it's the British versus the Boer Republic. Well, they fabricated a reason to have a war because they wanted gold. That's pretty much it. And the rest was all, and it all had these pseudo good reasons, but actually it was just driven by greed. And I think companies are prone to do that. I would say the ones that have a culture of how do we solve problems, the problems that God cares about, those are the ones that foster it. So I have some good friends who are running a company that you could say it competes with pharmaceutical companies, but they've created a culture where people with pharmaceutical type or medical solutions are coming to them because they know that they're fostering a situation where solutions can be furthered. And so they're doing really good work, and it does attract people. So
well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that there's the young people nowadays also, because of the availability of information and so on, they've got a pretty well dialed in, you could call it bullshit meter,
That's right.
Because there are
you talk to my older sons about that.
Yeah, because there's companies that do greenwashing. Oh yeah, we care about the environment, or we care about ethical stuff, and they got their list of values, but there's a disconnect between what the corporate propaganda says and what's legitimately happening, right? So right now, the big tech companies, what's the number one lie in corporate America? Our people are our most important asset. I mean, a friend of mine just posted a billboard in San Francisco right outside his house, and it's like a pro AI. Don't be hiring human beings. Like, it's like, I mean, God's in the people business, and the young people have a way of saying, like, this is crazy. This is not sustainable. And it's not the first time we've seen this cycle. I mean, I'm old enough to have been around the first wave of the internet. In 1995, we ran a conference, Christians and the Internet. We had to explain how it works and everything. I was telling people back then, one day missions would be done over the internet without people getting on a plane. They're like, oh, what do you mean, Then we had the Web 2 stuff, right? And that's when I wrote the I Operations book with my friend Gary Dacian from Cisco. What's the impact of internet-enabled technologies on companies and organizations, governments, healthcare, education? Now we're on the third wave, same patterns again, and people went through, oh yeah, business re-engineering. As my one client says to me, we took the work of 3 secretaries and we gave it to 2 secretaries and we call it business re-engineering. It's rubbish, and that's happening with AI right now. Some CEO sees a hackathon, and he says, oh yeah, these kids could quote unquote create a solution in a weekend. Why am I paying my IT department or my product managers $1.5 million or $5 million a year? And so they just say, we're going to cut 30% of our jobs because of AI. Well, it's stupid, right? And it's this concept of, we care for our people. No, they're spending all of their money on hardware and on hardware, power generation, etc., etc. So they have to lay off people. I mean, the companies are going through a pretty stupid cycle at the moment, and so I think people have to watch out for that. At the same time, there are serious opportunities to upskill and to get more done with less. But the question is, will it be the right stuff? Are we working on purpose? Or are we just trying to crunch out more with less to make more money? So we often get back to this question of purpose, in my view, and purpose should drive innovation. AI is not the biggest driver of innovation. Purpose has always been the biggest driver of innovation. There was a guy that wrote a book. Yeah, there was a guy that wrote a book many years ago. His name is Murkianos, like a good Greek name. And he studied the biggest companies that spent the most on R&D to find the correlation between R&D, spending on research and development, and innovation. And he found the correlation was 0. Yeah. The biggest driver of innovation is purpose. And people of faith should corner the market on purpose. I mean, we should really understand purpose well and translate it and say, well, if this is the biggest possible purpose that a company, an organization, a country, a city can have, if this is the biggest possible, the highest, most noble, most honorable purpose that this can have, then what innovation? How do we need to innovate? How do we need to structure our organization, our compensation, our reward systems, our processes, etc., etc.? Purpose is the big driver of innovation. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Intention. So we got 5 minutes left for this question here, which is not a 5-minute question, but I think hopefully maybe it might tie everything together with what we shared today. Um, have you heard of Douglas Rushkoff?
No.
He's Team Human, I think his kind of movement is. And a lot of what he talks about is, and I'm going to murder this term, but it's Keynesian economics or Keynesian? Keynesian. That's
Keynesian
it.
economics, yeah.
Economics. And so what he says is the Keynesian economic model sucks out value out of the marketplace, drives it into shareholder value, which drives profits for the CEOs, larger companies, or larger, the VP, the C-suite type of execs within a company, and then also the shareholders within an organization, or outside of it. And then on the opposite side, you have, in my opinion, one of the greatest leaders, Ron Paul, who's really a big advocate of Austrian economics and value creation. Why hasn't Austrian economics taken off in a way to really create this economic growth engine that would probably be quite significant, I would think? Any ideas around that?
Sure. Yeah. In my book, Transforming Society, I've covered this in three of my books, but in Transforming Society, I talk about what I call a societal value chain. It's a righteous cycle of work, you might call it. So it's pretty simple. This is promised land economics. It's just basic stuff. And it's there's a principle of raw materials. God puts raw materials in the earth. Say it's oil, it's gold, it's whatever, right? Or there's seed, there's natural resources. You take those, you work, you harvest those things, you get the resources together, you develop a product, you work a product, you create a market, you generate a profit, and you can build up wealth, you can build societal assets, you fill storehouses, but there's a whole cycle of work that goes from raw materials all the way around until you get to the economic assets, which is the storehouses, which in the Old Testament look after healthcare, education, roads, infrastructure, all of these things. It's not bring your tithe to the storehouse, meaning to your local church coffers. It's a much bigger societal concept. Now, in short, I think what's happened, and in the Keynesian economics versus other models, is that most of the money that is in the market today is money chasing money. So it's just happening at the tail end of the societal value chain. You've got, about 97% of the money that flows around the world every day, it's not going for real goods and services. It's not going into productive capacity, into real everyday work. It's into financials, derivatives, this and that. So it's money chasing money.
Right.
It's become a world unto itself versus the real cycle of work. And I think we have an opportunity in history. We have to ask ourselves, are we going to deploy capital to go into a full societal value chain that's going to bless many people around there? Or are we going to just try to make more money off money?
Great way to end. Thank you very much, Brent. And just wondering, do you want to close at all with anything else?
Yeah, I would just, if people want to track me down, they can go to just brettjohnson.biz. It's quite simple. .biz or biz, depending on what language you speak, And I've got some resources there. So we've talked a little bit about kingdom economics, transforming society, some other things, work-life integration. So there's different books, things there. People can track those down, or they can just drop me a message, and I'd be happy to unpack any of these things. And thank you so much, Andrew, for the opportunity to chat about these. I mean, I'm passionate about these topics. This is what life is about. And so thanks for the opportunity to talk about them.
My absolute pleasure. I rarely get to talk about this at this level, so it's wonderful. Thank you kindly, and have a wonderful day. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.